Okay, so I will probably talk for about half an hour or so. And thankfully, my son has just entered my house and he is screaming. So I hope that doesn't disturb you or this talk. This really is a sort of idea or viewpoint I've come to, and it's an idea that's beginning to develop in my head, particularly as I grow and develop as a manager and a lead of developers. And it's some sort of ideas and thoughts I want to share. So it's called the Humble Developer Culture, Create Better Software and a Better Working Environment. So just quickly, a little bit about me. I'm Rob. My handle on GitHub and Twitter is Rob D. Waller. Don't use Twitter quite so much anymore. Don't really have the time for it. But if you do have a message for me, you can contact me on Twitter and I will get back to you. I'm based in Aylesbury. I have 2 cats and 1 boy now. I've been writing software or been in the industry for about 16 years. Currently, head of backend development for LifeWorks and their application team. We are hiring and we do look for remote people. So if you are an experienced developer with skills in PHP, Python or Node, tap me up and yeah, maybe we can talk. I make a small contribution to the open source world. I have a PHP library called Really Simple JWT, which is something I've been working on for the last 4 or 5 years. Keep that ticking over. It's had a few downloads. A few people seem to like it. So yeah, it's my small contribution to make the world of software slightly better. So let's dive into the talk. When we're talking about culture, it's usually counterposed to a concept of control, right? Particularly if you're a manager, because you're trying to influence a team, right? And as a manager, or a team lead or a senior developer, you can take a couple of approaches. One is to try and control things, to micromanage people, to try and make every decision, try and influence every decision and control every single possible variable. Now, when I first started in management, probably 5-6 years ago now, I was probably towards the control side of things. I tried to control things. I don't think I fully realized how much I was trying to control at the time. And in many respects, it's a fool's errand, really. You end up just chasing your tail because the complexity involved in software development and trying to manage a team of software developers means you will never be in control of things. And it will just lead to frustration. So as I've grown as a developer and a sort of lead, I've sort of moved towards the idea of culture. And what I mean by culture is the idea that you try and influence and adjust the culture within which a team is working to try and get more positive outcomes. But you're not trying to micromanage and control everything. I think, as I said, you will fail if that is your approach. So this talk is about the sort of culture that you want to work in as a developer and the sort of culture you might want to create as a lead or a senior for others to work within, right? And it's sort of like that framework idea. But of course, it's not always like that simple, right? Because it's a question of sort of like, what culture do you want to develop? And there are some sort of negative cultures out there that you may not want to work within or sort of create. And some of the ones we know, we've got a cutesy picture of a unicorn here, but this is in reference to some of these ideas around like the unicorn developer or the rockstar developer or the 10x developer. Cultures that seemed to be quite popular sort of 5-6 years ago, with lots of recruiters banging on about them. And these cultures were sort of based around the simple concept that your culture revolved around this idea of hiring talented individuals giving them trinkets and treats, trying to keep them in the office as much as possible, and then applying some pressure. And these rockstar developers or unicorn developers would respond to these trinkets and pressures by outputting huge amounts of code. That was the theory anyway, and the reality, though, is often very different, because it's very difficult to find talent, and it's very difficult to define what talent is exactly. And talent can mean different things in different contexts. And, you know, applying pressure really in the end just leads to burnout, right? And all the trinkets in the world, you know, all the free lattes and beer fridges, don't make up for that. They can't solve the problem of burnout. So there are negative cultures, and if you're encouraging these sort of cultures around sort of like unicorns, or even something I tend to refer to as like genius syndrome, where you're encouraging developers to believe in their own hype and own genius, you will fail. So the question is, what is a sort of better or more useful culture? And I suppose before we jump into that, we sort of have to define what we mean by culture. And obviously, you know, I'm not a philosopher, so I don't have a clear definition of what culture is, but it sort of means a few things to me in the sort of software development context. It means sort of attitude. So what is your attitude towards software development? The principles you follow, and then the approach you take to solve problems. And that's what this talk will focus on. And the reason sort of this talk has developed and why I came up with this is because recently, as I mentioned, I've become a manager again around January this year. And I was trying to deal with the problem of thinking about, like, how do I change or improve things at the company I'm working at? You know, how do I adjust things? And sort of, I was reading a great book by David West called Object Thinking, and he talked about culture, that you need to change the culture and help educate developers. So this is why I started looking into the idea of culture and what is the sort of culture I wanted to create or encourage. And it's not just something that I want to encourage where I work, it's something I think is probably a good idea for most people, right? So this is where this idea of like the humble developer culture comes from. And this idea as developers, and our attitude should be to be humble. And this sort of idea first sort of struck me probably, I think it must have been about 5 or 6 years ago now, when I was at PHP South Coast, which is, I don't believe is going any longer, but was a great little conference down in Portsmouth. And I saw Marco Pavetta give a talk, or Cramius, who is very well known in the industry. In fact, he is someone you might classify as a sort of like unicorn developer, if you were ever to use the term. His influence on PHP is enormous. If you use PHP, as you do, most of you do, I imagine, you will have interacted with some of his code. He's had a huge impact on the language. But anyway, at the time, Marco gave this, I thought, a fantastic talk on what he called extremely defensive PHP. And one of the things that jumped out at me was he had this part in the talk where he said this sort of statement: you are dumb, I am dumb, we are dumb, everyone is dumb. And I don't know if Marco thought this, but I found this to be a sort of profound statement. Here was this amazing developer who sort of has a lot of respect and almost adoration, saying, I am dumb. You know, that's an interesting concept, right? For someone of that capability to say, I am dumb. But it comes back to this idea of being humble. And I think Marco is probably, at his core, quite a humble man, right? Now, in some respects, using the term dumb is a sort of slightly hackneyed way of getting to a philosophical point that has been around for a very long time. Like Marco didn't come up with this idea of being humble. It goes way, way back and probably predates the chap in this picture, which is Socrates. But Socrates, one of his great sort of ideas that he sort of passed on to people like Plato and Xenophon and Aristotle was this idea of a wise person is aware of the limits of their knowledge, right? Like, if you're wise, you understand what you don't know as much as you understand what you do know. And this is a really important point, right? And I think it's something that's really important to doing software development, to know the limits of your knowledge and to be open and honest when you don't know something or you need to look into something. And it stands counterposed to that idea of the rockstar developer, or this idea of, you know, being a genius, right? Like, we're not necessarily or really geniuses. There are limits to our knowledge, and we should accept that, and that should be our approach. And if that is our approach, it sort of makes us a bit more cautious and even lends into the ideas that Marco was trying to convey in his talk about extremely defensive PHP. You know, be careful. You're moving through a landmine field, and you might explode at some point. So, like, be aware of the limits of your knowledge and be humble and sort of accepting of that, and sort of don't pretend, you know, you're some sort of genius. So this sort of, you know, comes to some points about how, you know, you approach things, like as a developer, like ask questions, ask for help, communicate clearly, like communicate with your team members, you know, and this is the point, right? You're a humble developer working in a team of people trying to solve a problem, and you're all taking this approach of that you need help at times, and you don't know everything. So you need to communicate, you need to interact and ask for help and ask questions, ask lots of questions. And that's the sort of like humble, cautious approach that you should be taking to software development, because it's difficult, hard, and complicated. So that's the sort of attitude that you can take. And then there are the sort of principles that lean into that or sort of go along with this idea, right? So some of the principles I tend to believe in, and I think align with this, is these ideas of clean, tested, and secure. They're very much sort of like the basics to software development, and they should be encouraged. They should be part of the culture, right? Like, you're trying to write clean code, you're trying to write tested code, and you're trying to keep it secure, because you're humble enough to appreciate that things will go wrong, right? And also that other people have to use and interact with your code. So you keep it clean so that other people can interact it and understand it and use it. You test it because you know things are you're likely to generate bugs simply by writing code. So you're going to try and test your code to make sure you minimize bugs. And then you're looking at security issues, right? Like, what are the basic security things you should be covering? Because you want to try and minimize as much as possible any, you know, attack surface you have, right? Because you know that there are bad actors out there who will try and, you know, exploit what you've built. So what do these things look like? So when we talk about clean or clean code, you know, we're talking about running static analysis. So you're thinking about linting so that you comply with a common syntax so everyone sort of understands it. Type checks, possibly. I mean, some people don't like types, but I'm a bit of a fan of types. I think types, A, help describe code, make it easy to understand, but they also make it more reliable, right? And it removes a whole layer of bugs from your code. And then sometimes something that's often missed when it comes to sort of static analysis is complexity checks. So running checks like cyclomatic complexity or npath complexity to see how complicated the code is. And really what that's looking at is sort of how many control structures, say, a method contains. And if it's got too many, it's probably too complicated. So it's probably quite difficult for someone to understand and to read and to edit. It's not very clean, it's not very usable by other people. So complexity checks are a good thing. Then there's the idea around theory, and there's loads of theory out there, and the things I've listed here are not, they're not the complete theory of software development. They're just some of the theory that you can look into. So there's obviously there's the sort of much possibly overused term of solid, so single responsibility. I can't remember it now. It's been an open close principle, Liskov substitution, interface segregation, and dependency inversion, I think, is solid. But yeah, so solid is a useful one, particularly single responsibility. Then there's more advanced ideas around clean architecture and sort of code isolation. They're useful to look into. And then some of Marco's ideas around defensive programming, I think are very, very useful as well. But there's lots of other theory out there. So like I'm currently reading, as I said, object thinking. There's a huge amount of good ideas in David West's book, Object Thinking. I will reference it later. But this is what we're trying to achieve, right? This is the culture we're trying to create, like clean code, like encourage clean code, because it helps other developers work with the code you write. Then there is, of course, tests. And we write tests for a number of reasons. One, we're trying to sort of minimize bugs, but if you take a more advanced approach like test-driven development, you're beginning to look at the concept of like behavior and understand the idea of behavior. So you write your tests first, or really write what you're doing when you write your test first is you're outlining the behavior you expect the system to comply with. And then you begin to write the code that matches or aligns with those tests or the behavior you expect. And you go through a refactor. There's a sort of red-green refactor, and slowly code improves. And code begins to emerge from the process of you writing your tests under TDD. And emergent properties align quite well with complexity theory, which is a very interesting topic and something I've been reading a lot on. But complexity theory is very useful. Another reason why you shouldn't be focused on like control, right? Because again, complexity theory, if you've read a bit about it, suggests that you won't get very far if you focus on control too much. But, not only are there benefits from testing of like your focus on behavior, which is generally good for your software development, but also the way you structure your code is helped a lot by tests. Mainly because if code isn't simple and isolated, it's difficult to test, right? So if you've got a piece of code which has some input output in it, so it's going away and calling some sort of service, some sort of API or server or database, and within that you've implanted a huge amount of business logic, and then you return your final result, it will be difficult to test, right? Because you've got to somehow mock the call to the database or the API, and then you've got your business logic all muddled in there as well. Ideally, what you do is you begin to isolate your code and you start thinking about, well, okay, I'll go and retrieve my code in one place, and then I will run my business logic over the top of it and process it or parse it or do whatever you want to do with it in another place, right? And then you can write simple unit tests for the business logic, and you can write simple mocked tests for sort of integration tests for the IO code. And then obviously there's the third part to that often, which is like orchestration, like how we orchestrate IO and business logic together, right? So testing can lead to better code, but it cuts out your bugs, it helps you focus on behavior, and it can help you produce better code. So I mean, I think encouraging testing is a very sensible thing and part of a sort of humble approach to development. Assume your code won't work, so write some tests for it. And then there's security, right? Again, your assumption should be that someone may or probably will try and attack what you've built, right? So you need to get some basics down and working on. So, you know, you can make sure your runtimes are up to date, make sure your dependencies are up to date. There's lots of tools for that, depend upon other things. And then there's static analysis tools like Sonar Cloud for doing actual security checks on the code you've written, which can be super useful. And then there's further, like if you want to take it further, obviously you get pen testers involved and automated pen test systems and various other things. But like security is something that you should take very seriously. And not just as a developer, but if you're a lead, you should be encouraging the company that you work in to take security seriously and really think it through, right? Because it's not really a question of if, it's usually a question of when someone will try and like attack you. So you should be aware of that, and you should be taking mitigating, you should be trying to mitigate the problem. And you've also got to think nowadays about how the authorities and regulatory bodies will respond to a major breach, right? So if there is a major breach, have you got negligent practices, right? So like if you're still running PHP5 and you've had a massive data breach, someone's probably going to query that and look at, you know, the fine that you get levied may be slightly higher. So security is another important thing. Always assume, you know, not the worst, but assume that someone's going to, like, there is the potential that someone will actually attack you, and you should be thinking about it. So they're the sort of principles. There's sort of, as I said, there's clean code, there's testing, and there's security, and sort of encouraging these concepts in dev teams, whether you're a senior or a lead, I think can help. And then there's your approach to software development. Like, how do you approach the problem of software development? And I've got this concept of the behavioral approach, but really this is just a sort of like, I suppose, what you'd call for a number of concepts that are already well understood. So like agile development practices, extreme programming, and TDD, even concepts like that. But the point here is that you focus on the behavior, right? So, and this is counterposed to what is traditionally known as the sort of formalist approach, where you're more interested in tools and implementation. The behavioral approach is to focus on the behavior that you're trying to replicate in the software you're building, right? Because that will, and then tooling and implementation is an afterthought, right? And basically, you're focusing on understanding the domain, right? And the reason, again, this comes back to the idea of sort of complexity and emergent properties, right? Like software development, software itself is very difficult to plan out perfectly, or basically it's impossible to plan out software perfectly because things always change. And right, the whole theory around agile development practices is that things will change and you need to be able to respond quickly. And the behavioral approach and sort of domain understanding are about the idea that software emerges from the process of you better understanding the domain and better understanding the behavior you want to replicate in your software. So you should really focus on that behavior, right? And not what this idea of, so this is a statement that's often used, data structures plus algorithms. Some people the formalists refer to software development as just data structures plus algorithms. So basically, you just have data in a data store, you pull it out of the data store, and then you run some algorithms over it. And that's how simple software development is. That isn't really how simple software development is, because it's not really what you're doing. You're trying to replicate some behavior in software, and it's a very different approach. So there's sort of like the differences between these formalist and behavioral approaches. So if you're taking a sort of more formalist approach, you've got to focus on technology and implementation rather than a focus on behavior and domain knowledge. Software is designed defined and then implemented, or defined, designed and implemented. Whereas on the behavioral side, software emerges from domain understanding, right? Like you have emergent properties in complexity theory. Formalist approach will have lots of documentation and design, right? So you try and basically precisely define what you're going to do before you do it, right? Which is always really difficult and comes to the next point. And then, but on the behavioral side, it's you're doing just enough documentation and design to see you through the next small stage of development, really. It's not to say that there's no documentation and no design and no planning, right? And this can be a problem with certain companies and their approach to agile, right? Like some companies' approaches to agile means that we just don't do any planning and we don't do any documentation and design because we're agile. And that's not the case at all. It's not saying you don't do any, it's just saying that you do enough to get you through the next iteration of your development. And the reason this is because under the formalist approach, if you're defining everything, you have to take the assumption that little will change, right? That you can perfectly design this and nothing will change in the 6 months of design. Well, that's not realistic because things always change, expectations change. You might get a new client who wants slightly different functionality, all sorts of things. So like on the behavioral side of things, again, you assume everything can change. And again, like it's a slightly more humble outlook, assuming things can change, right? If you assume nothing can change and that you're in complete control and you can perfectly solve a problem, you're not being very humble. So you should definitely assume everything can change so you can be agile, right? And there are plenty of techniques that help you with this behavioral approach. So as I mentioned before, there's test-driven development, which is sort of like a first pass at sort of behavior, like a focus on behavior. There's pair programming. And again, this aligns with sort of like emergent software ideas. You know, you work with a partner or a couple of people and you pair program on a problem, and you don't necessarily have a design up front. You understand the behavior you're trying to, and you have some domain understanding, and then you work together and the software sort of emerges from that process. Obviously, there's domain-driven design, which is a sort of bigger concept. I'm not an expert on domain-driven design. There are plenty of experts out there who you should look into. There's little ideas like example mapping. We've been trying this at work a little bit, but example mapping is a great way to get in sort of behavior-driven development. Like it quickly draws out what is the behavior by using examples. And then there's slightly bigger concept of event storming. Again, I'm not an expert on event storming, but it is a very useful approach to understanding your domain. And by understanding your domain and behavior, you will be able to produce better software. So to sort of wrap up, there's the humble developer, right? Like you as a developer, right? So you will want to ask questions and ask for help, right? You're not like some sort of superhuman computer who can solve problems on their own in perfect isolation. You question yourself, you assume things are going to be wrong, right? Like you assume that you may not get things right. That's why you write tests. That's why you run static analysis. That's why you think about security problems. You question your code as well. Again, same reasons. You accept change will happen. It's always going to happen. So you accept it and then you can be a bit more agile. You accept things aren't going to be perfect. Nothing, you know, you accept imperfection because you will not ever have complete knowledge of a domain and complete knowledge of what the client behavior is, right? That will never happen. So you have to sort of be okay with that imperfection. And again, as I've just touched on, you focus on behavior and you believe that software will emerge from processes rather than being perfectly designed up front. And then there's the sort of humble lead concept, right? Which is sort of overarching to this sort of like humble developer culture, or this culture that you're trying to create. So like if you are a lead or even a senior, or even in just a position of mentoring someone, right? Like you're just trying to, you act in a different way. You're there to guide, right? Like primarily you're there to guide others and help them along. You're not there to tell them, when you're going through the sort of difficult mountain pass, as this picture sort of alludes to, you're not there to tell each person where to step precisely, like and what to do, and like that's not of help. You're there to sort of just provide some guidance, like don't run at that cliff face or don't run at that cliff edge, right? And you're there to sort of educate as well. Try and, this comes back to an idea that many people have touched on it, which is the idea of like better developers, right? So like if you want to improve the culture, you're there as a lead to try and educate and share ideas and create open conversations with the other developers so that they can learn, and you can do that mentoring. And then you're there to support, right? Like you're there to help developers get through the difficult problems that they may face. You're not there to shout at them and to tell them they're wrong. You're there to sort of support them and get them through the problems they face. So yeah, that's the humble lead. And the benefits of this, right? So if you take this sort of more humble approach and you try and foster this culture, you will get better, more robust software out the back, right? Because people will be more considerate about what they're trying to develop. They will be writing tests. They will be working with their colleagues to produce this code, right? It's not just going to rest on the shoulders of some single genius. It's going to be a team effort, and that will lead to better output. You will get better team cohesion, right? Because you won't have the rockstar, basically arsehole developer ruining everything for everyone. You're going to work together as a team, and people are going to be aware of their limitations and aware of the support they have. And you're going to have increased flexibility. So you should be able to respond to problems more quickly and in a more agile way. So yeah, I hope I've sort of convinced you on like why a sort of more humble culture will work. I know that this talk or this idea isn't fully formed yet, but I think I'm going in the right direction. And I hope you share that feeling too. Just to wrap up, I thought sort of share some books and topics that I think are useful. There's a sort of well-known Test-Driven Development by Kent Beck. That's a really good book that properly explains TDD, and that TDD is really about behavior and emergent software rather than just purely writing tests. I think it's well worth a read. Certainly the first part is. There's a book I'm reading currently, which was suggested to me by someone on Twitter, probably one of the best suggestions I ever got off Twitter, which is Object Thinking by David West, which again talks about complexity theory and the behavioral approach and sort of replicating behavior in software and how you do that with objects. It's probably one of the best books I've read on software development in my career. There's then, if you want the wider topic of complexity theory and emergence and these ideas, Complexity, a Guided Tour by Melanie Mitchell is again an amazing book. It has a huge amount of interesting stuff on software, things like cellular automata, which is just got me really hooked and very interested very quickly. I wrote a load of code on that to see how I could make it work. And there's loads more stuff on software. That is a brilliant book, in fact. And then finally, as a developer and sort of taking that humble approach, I like to read things, and I suggest to people that or developers that they should read outside of the direct world of software development to get other ideas, right? Because software development doesn't exist in isolation. Lots of the ideas that we have come from different places. Design patterns come from architecture rather than, and manufacturing, and even lean development practices and ideas come from elsewhere. And one book, you know, I've referenced him in this talk, and I've referenced him previously. There's a great book on Socrates by Paul Johnson. Very short, very readable, really interesting, particularly about the sort of beginnings of that sort of what we tend to classify as Western philosophy. It's definitely worth a read, and Socrates had a number of interesting ideas about life and the world. So it's an interesting chap to read about. And yeah, that's it. Let's have a chat. I'll answer any questions, and thank you for listening for half an hour.
Thank you very much. Am I unmuted?
Shall I stop sharing my screen?
No. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, brilliant. Right, yes. I was having a mute-related problem. Thank you very much for that talk. That was really thought-provoking. And yeah, there's lots of things in there that I think I found quite useful, and I'm sure others did too. I've got a question. What were you mentioned on one of the slides, oh, actually, if anyone's got questions, just pop them in the Q&A or the chat, and then we'll read them out. But you mentioned, was it example mappings? What was that?
Example mapping.
Yeah, did you have that on a slide?
I did. Example mapping is a super simple form of it's a super simple form of event storming, basically. I've got something I can share. If I can just load it up, take a minute. I can share what it is with you quickly. So if I'll share my screen again. Can you see that?
Yeah.
So basically, what can you currently see?
I can see that was your example mapping, looked like some kind of drawing application.
Yeah, lucid chart, I think.
Yeah, that was it. Yeah.
Anyway, Zoom is playing up for me, but can you see story, rule, question, example?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So basically, example mapping is you start with a story. So your product owner will define a story. And I'll give you an example in a minute of this. You then have rules that the story complies with. So like the rules of the story. You then, for each rule, you define examples, right? So like user A wants to purchase Y for X amount of pounds. They pay Y amount, they pay 20% tax. The total is £12 or something, right? And then you have questions. Basically, either when you begin the conversation, you start writing down questions and then rules emerge, or there might be questions with no answer right now. So the product owner has to go away. But example mapping does two things. A, it helps you understand your domain really quickly. And it's often said that the example mapping meeting should only focus on one or two stories and be about half an hour. But it also gives you a bunch of examples which you can then turn into tests. So to sort of highlight this, I did this with my team. So we started with this: for every $1 spent, a user receives 1 loyalty point. And then you have a rule for this system. At the surface, this story seems really simple, like it's not complicated at all. but you have a rule that says loyalty points don't accrue on tax. So then you have an actual example. User A purchases product Y for $10 with 20% tax added. Their total spend is $12 and they receive 10 loyalty points, right? And suddenly with this example, it's super clear and you can actually turn that really easily into a unit test. So when you do this calculation of loyalty points based on spend, you have a test out of the box. And we did this, we went through this with the team, right? And we started with this idea of one story about one loyalty point. And I just said to the team, what questions would you have about this system? And we started asking questions over the course of probably about half an hour. And like, we had questions like, do you get loyalty points for spending loyalty points? What is a loyalty point worth? Like, what happens if there is a refund?
Yeah.
And then like you start building out that domain knowledge and you get these examples at the end that developers can go away and work on, right? And you can develop this over time, but it quickly draws out and highlights the complexity of the story, right? Which might on its surface seem really simple. That's my long answer to what example mapping is.
I can see this being incredibly useful.
Yeah, there is a I'll stop sharing now, but there is some documentation on it that I'll try and find a link. Guys at Cucumber wrote a really great article on example mapping. Just sort of explains it. Yeah, it's very much along these sort of BDD lines.
Yeah, it's reminding me of event storming. Done a little bit of event storming, but that looks really useful, that example mapping too. Definitely going to check that out.
It's sort of like it's a much simpler, like lower barrier to entry than event storming, even though I've seen event storming. My team's done event storming and they've found it super useful. So event storming is also useful, but like if you want to get going with this BDD approach to things, then example mapping can be a good way to introduce it to a team and sort of introduce the benefits.
Yeah, because recently there's just a few bits of work that I've been working on where it's quite an established code base and you kind of have a feature which in itself is relatively easy to implement and test. But then you forget about the interactions with other bits. Like if you have a secret flag, we don't send emails, where we've just added a whole load of things where people get sent text messages and we're like, we never thought about that when we were kind of, they're three almost on the face of it, completely orthogonal things, but then they do come together. And then that's where, people start getting text messages when they weren't expecting them and stuff like that. So I think actually applying this would just get people thinking about things. And I imagine once people thought of a few questions, they think of a few more. It's possibly great for bouncing.
Complexity tends to spiral, right? As soon as you sort of pull that pin or pull that, it spirals. But it's useful, particularly for getting business people to realize what they're asking for, right? Because they might be like, oh, we just want a loyalty system. It's really simple. Just like knock that together in a couple of sprints, right?
Yeah. Oh, well, thank you very much for sharing that. I found on Cucumber a blog post about it from 8th of December 2015. So I'll share that round. We'll tweet that out. Well, when I say we, I think probably Lee will. So we've got a few questions from Dan. Oh, he might even be joining us.
Maybe. Who knows?
Do you want to read your questions out?
No, I'm going to fiddle with my camera.
Okay.
Because it's obviously not working.
Shall I read your first question out then?
Yes, please.
Dan asks, what do you do about the troublesome people who don't get why they should care about their colleagues?
I mean, that is a difficult question, really, right? Like that is management and almost HR level topic, right? I mean, the first step is obviously to try and engage and educate or work with that developer and try and understand why they have that belief, right? Why they don't think they need to care about their colleagues, or, you know, that they, you know, their approach to development sort of rubs up against that. That would be the first step. I mean, ultimately, it depends how that path, where that ultimately that path can lead to, you know, that person leaving your organization, right? Because in many respects, particularly as a manager, you have to think about the team as a whole, right? Like it's the team well-being. It's not at the end of the day, rather than the individual's specific well-being, right? You could start any problem like that with the individual's well-being in mind and at the heart of your approach, but ultimately it depends on how that goes. But it's probably, you begin with some engagement and possibly some education. It might be that they're a little junior and inexperienced, and that's usually a relatively easy problem to solve. It might just be a bigger problem. I don't know. It depends on the individual and it depends on the circumstance, but you have to engage to begin with and try and educate and try and lead them onto the right path if you can, encourage them. But ultimately you may not be able to do that, and it's a question of what's more important, the well-being of the team, or, you know, the well-being of one individual, right? It's a difficult one. Like philosophers have tried to solve that problem for centuries. I'm not sure they've done it perfectly.
Cool.
Do you want to do your second question, Dan?
Yeah. What can you do to protect the culture of your team when you're working in a large company that has bad culture outside of your team? What can you do to protect them?
I mean, that is difficult again, right? That's not an easy problem to solve. That is, I suppose, again, an education piece and sort of trying to drive home the value to the business of what you're trying to do, but also highlighting to your developers to some degree as well that some of these external forces are irrelevant, right? Because often if you're a manager or a lead, right, you're the person who is judging performance, right? And you're not going to judge the performance based on external factors. You're judging them based on how your developers are doing. And that's a useful point to make to them, that, you know, that ultimately you've got their back, right? And you're going to support them and be there and try and protect them and help them. You know, and that some problems, like the product owner problem, right? So this is a traditional one. Product owner agrees with the business that piece of software X is going to be delivered on date Y, right?
Yeah, that's a problem. Yeah.
My position on something like that is always, well, that's the product owner's problem, not yours. As a developer, that's not your problem. You didn't do this. If you don't deliver on that time, you're not going to be judged on that. You're not going to be judged by me on that. That's down to them. If they promise something silly to the business, that's on them.
Okay.
And it's difficult. I know it's difficult, but yeah, it's a continual kind of iterative educational piece as well, and trying to improve the culture. And hopefully by improving the culture a bit, the business will see the value of it. Obviously, again, if it's a really bad business that you're working for, then you might have to take you and your colleagues elsewhere. I don't know.
Yeah. That's quite often a good idea. In some circumstances, there's not much you can do yourself.
Right, we've got a couple of questions from the floor. First one, Rob, do you have code culture meetings with your team every other week. So the question says, usually we have this at our place where we share values and ideas across our team on issues some of us have with the code, especially after the retros. Would you recommend such a thing?
We don't actually, but that's actually quite a good idea that I might steal. I quite like that. But we do something similar. We tend to do workshops. So we will have a meeting maybe once a week or every other week, usually on a Friday, where we workshop something. So we did an example mapping workshop where we talked it through, but often it might be one of the tools that the developers have been working on. They share it, they talk about it, and we come together as a team. We also have a sort of back-end meeting as well, where we catch up every other week. But we haven't done code culture, but that's an interesting idea. Yeah, I mean, there's many ways to solve this problem. So I wouldn't say that there's like one way of doing it. I think you've got to try to influence the culture. You need to try a number of things, right? And depending on your context and where you're working, different approaches will work, right? And other approaches might not.
I mean, code review, I suppose, is one more continuous way of doing it, really, isn't it? You've got people reviewing it all the time. And I suspect maybe you can pull out things to the wider team. Based on looking at a bit of a code, you say, well, actually, perhaps this is how we should approach this, and then share that with the wider team. But I do like the questionnaire was anonymous, but I do like the I really like that code culture meeting idea. So the next question, what can someone who is perceived as the person who knows everything do to get rid of that perception? I don't like it, it's no good for me, and it's no good for the squad.
I mean, first of all, is to admit, right, that you don't know everything, and start trying to communicate that to the team, and also start working with others in the team and encourage them to take responsibility for areas of, that you might feel that are being put on you, right? It's a difficult problem. I think it can occur in any team, right? Because often the developer can be the most knowledgeable person of the domain and the software, right? So it becomes a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy that they're always going to be gone to. But I think it's a case of just putting up your hand initially and saying, I don't know everything, and I need some support, right? Like, ask for some support. I can't help you with this today. I don't know, Sarah or James will help you today. They know this just as well. Ask them. I think it's a case of like communicating with your team and sort of trying to share out that responsibility, right? So that you aren't like the developer who knows everything, right? Because no one is, right? And you have more talented and more experienced developers within the team. That's just natural, but like, it doesn't mean that that developer knows everything or needs to solve every single problem, right? They don't. I hope that helps with that.
Yeah, thank you. Got a question from Robin. He asks, you mentioned domain-based thinking, knowing your domain, etc. What do you mean by a domain? I'm assuming it's not time, space, frequency, etc., as is the case in Fourier transforms.
This is really about the sort of behavior that you're talking about, and domains can be like of different sizes dependent on what you're building, right? So a domain might be, let's say you're building a new like delivery app, the new Deliveroo or something, I don't know, you're building it. That in theory is a domain, right? And there'll be a bunch of behavior that you want to replicate, right? But within that domain, I suppose you would drill down into specific domain areas, right? So one might be like communication or marketing strategy, and like you might build some software to send out a bunch of automated messages when people make an order, right? And that will begin to become its own domain possibly, and you will then have behavior associated with that you want to achieve, right? Which might be, you know, when the user makes an order, we want them to receive a message informing them that their order will be delivered in X minutes, right? That would be the behavior, and then you work out how you do that. But yeah, so a domain can be sort of big and sort of small. I would, a person who knows a lot about this, who's talked about it in the past, I think is Kieran McNulty. He's quite big on the sort of DDD side of things. He's got some talks on YouTube and what have you. So he can probably explain it a lot better than me. But like the domain is sort of, I suppose, the behavioral context of what you're looking at.
Brilliant, thank you very much. I think that is it for, oh no, we've got one more question. How do we sell this to management? They usually don't see the benefits of things like tests or code reviews.
It's difficult, right? But I think it's a case of beginning to do these things, and like, I mean, there are a number of tactics I've tried over the years, right? So you try and show the benefits, right? And that can be through, obviously, observability is your friend, right? In these things, like if, say, for instance, you haven't got any tests, right? You have no tests. Set up your testing framework, set up PHP unit, run PHP unit and generate a code coverage report, and then show it to someone and show that you've got zero coverage. Then maybe connect that, if you're logging bugs somewhere, to how many bugs you have, whether that's in Jira or some other sort of, or Trello or whatever you're using for ticket management, or it might be a logging system, you know, and you might be showing, well, we're getting 15,000 bugs a day come through and we've got no test coverage. This is a problem. This means our users aren't going to be having the best experience, right? Like metrics, observability can be your friend. Share that with, you know, business leaders. Yeah, I mean, definitely that's one way. Obviously, you can try and terrify them, you know, point out, you know, the potential for security vulnerabilities. Good one is to share the recent BA story about their data breach and the hundreds of millions of pounds that they were fined for a small JavaScript, I think it was a JavaScript library on their front end, which allowed the hackers to skim credit card details. And basically that small mistake cost them hundreds of millions of quid, right? So like, I think, you know, it's about communicating this thing. Observability is definitely a place to start, like start producing metrics on how good your code is. And that they will understand that. The whole point of observability is that you can understand the quality of a code base, or understand more of about a code base without ever having to look at the code.
I suppose a few points I'd also add is, you know, if you're a software developer, you shouldn't be asking for permission to write unit tests. That's just your job. If you want to add in code review, like GitHub, Bitbucket, GitLab, you just turn it on. It's free. There's nothing, you don't need to do anything. You just go in there. It's about 2 or 3 clicks, and then code reviews on. And then just as the development team, we just do it. Don't tell them. It's your, you know.
That's a very good point. Like ask for forgiveness, not for permission, right?
Yeah. When I have some decorating done or the electrician's done, I don't ask them what they're doing. They just go and do what they know. You know, I think there's, developers just need to take some responsibility in that respect, really.
Yeah, it's almost like it's a profession, isn't it? You've hired me to do this job. I'm going to do this job to the best of my ability, and with the best tools that I can to make sure I build something that does not break for you and cost you lots of money. It's that whole thing about time up front is saving much more time down the line when you've saved 10,000 bugs because you had a few unit tests. Just getting in the mentality as a developer for actually working in that way as well, that does take sometimes can take a bit of time to adjust to, but it is worth it.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point actually about the upfront cost, right? Like that's why you do domain discovery and you do like example mapping at the start, right? Because you want to do that domain discovery so you know what you need to build, right? The worst thing that often happens in software development is you do the domain discovery while you're writing the code. You're like, oh, well, this didn't work, or I've produced this software and I've shown it to the client and the client said, oh, I don't like that. That's not what we wanted, right? That's the worst because you've already written the code or you're in the middle of it. So I think that's a really good point, actually.
Has anyone else got any questions? Just say pop them in the Q&A or the chat.
I've got a question. How do you think, or what challenges do you think that, like, how we've been working for the last year and a bit, what challenges does like remote working present in terms of building team cultures, and potentially also moving forward where we may see sort of hybrid working structures where you've got some people that are remote and some people that may be in an office with a team, but it's all one team, if you see what I mean?
It's a difficult one. It's a funny one as well, because in some respects it's made it, there's a lot of benefits to it, right? Because it's leveled the playing field, right? Because probably before the pandemic, I was working in quite hybrid teams where some people would be in the office and some people would be remote, and you'd have that terrible thing whereby some of you would be in meeting room and then some of you would be on like the telly, but it wasn't very good. And like, I mean, I did work at a company for a while who had a really great setup in terms of like they were remote first and it worked really well, the hybrid approach. It has presented some challenges, but it has in some respects leveled things out, right? Because you all have to have meetings in the same way now.
Yes.
It is more difficult to possibly push a culture, I suppose. But I think one of the challenges is obviously through the pandemic is being supportive of your team members and being understanding of the stresses that they are under. Like if you're a parent and you've got your kid at home because of COVID and stuff, like as a manager and as a colleague, you've got to be aware of that and understand that they might not be available immediately. You know, people have got COVID and they need time off, or, you know, so the support side is a much bigger piece, and trying to be there for your team members is a challenge, right? It's not always easy to do it. I know that sometimes, you know, I could offer a bit more support if I had a bit more time. I'd like to. So yeah, that's the challenge. I think it's just being there and being supportive to your team members at times when they're going through some difficult things, right? That can be a real challenge.
Yeah. I've always, well, it's my experience is that if you've got a team all doing the same thing, whether you're all remote or you're all together in an office, it's easier and more straightforward to form how you work together than if you've got some people remote and some people in an office space. And I think it'll be interesting to see as we move forward. Certainly, I know from my own personal perspective, there'll be hybrid working, there'll be some days in office, some days at home, and it will be interesting to see how it pans out in terms of what we find works best, because I think it's working with everyone remote, because as you say, the playing field is level. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see how things pan out moving forwards.
Yeah, I mean, I think where I work currently, it will probably never fully go back, or there will be odd office days where there'll be specific reasons behind going to the office. But general day-to-day work will all be done sort of remotely, I imagine.
Yeah, I think that's the viewpoint from the discussions that I've been involved in. It will probably make the days that we actually see each other in an office almost more productive, because it will focus that time for that specific purpose, that specific meeting, using the time, and then having other days remote at home to focus in on actually just doing some work and getting some stuff, some code actually written, etc.
Yeah, probably you'll do more of a team building session, right? When you get everyone in the office and try and solve maybe a specific problem, or just to socialize a bit and just to sort of do that team bonding a bit. It has been weird joining a company and joining a team and still not having met any of them yet. We've still not managed to meet each other. But
I'm in that situation too. I've met various people now, but yeah, I've only been in my role for like 5 months or something. So yeah, it's a strange way of going about things. But then when you do meet people, it's actually quite nice, because you've had that kind of, you've been working with them for a while, so that's not a kind of immediate, like the immediate kind of initial meeting. You've kind of almost moved past that already, so you kind of know them when you first meet them. It's just quite nice.
Absolutely. Yeah, it would be fun.
If I can go back to one of the earlier questions, somebody was asking about what can you do to prevent the problem of a single person becoming the person that everyone goes to ask questions about. I can't remember which talk it was, but somebody mentioned a couple of years ago at another PHP Southwest meetup that forming committees for various topics of interest, so like front end build tools or back end tests committee, and then whenever somebody's got a problem with one of those things, they can send an email to a group of people rather than it always being a single person. And what that does is, first of all, means that the email is not always just going to one person, but you can get junior people to be, oh, you're working on the front end. That means you're going to be part of the front end build tools committee, so that we can get your input from the problems you're encountering every day, and then you can help manage that bit of the project. If you're currently in a situation where one person knows everything, it might be the case that to begin with that person needs to be on every committee. But even if that's the case, at least then they can say, look, I'm on too many committees. I need to give up this one, give up this one, give up this one. Some other people need to take on that task of being the person who knows about it. And of course, documentation as well.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. I've seen a thing called communities of practice work very well at other companies, where they did exactly that, where you had like they had a COP on testing and then a COP on something else, and yeah, you spread the responsibility, right, for an area of expertise.
Yeah.
I read an article the other day called Lucky Lotto Chaos Engineering for Teams. Basically, this was I think some teams have actually actioned this somewhere, but basically every week, I think or every sprint, they had a lottery, and they pulled a name from a hat, and basically whoever's name came out of the hat was not going to be available to the rest of the team for for that particular time period. They would be obviously still working, but working on other areas. And as and when anything came up that person would normally have been the go-to person for, obviously that person is still there, so still could help out if necessary, but it basically was challenging the people that were left on the team to actually find out how to solve whatever issues that came up. So quite quite an interesting, quite harsh way perhaps of going about things, but yeah, I found it quite an interesting read.
I think that's a really interesting idea. We've had a similar issue at our work. One of our sort of senior developers has taken a 3-week holiday, and we're all like, fingers crossed. But everything's been fine, right? Like other people do actually step up when they need to, right?
Yeah. And suddenly you find solutions because you kind of forced to find them and stuff. And it does again highlight the needs for documentation, etc. I'm just going to see if I can find the article. I'll share it that I was reading.
I do have a couple of book recommendations as well. One of them's called Peopleware by DeMarco and Lister. It's just about how to build teams that work well within each other. It's definitely worth reading, but I don't have a copy in front of me. And the other two books are, if I can do this. It's not a particularly positive book, but it does talk a lot about how to deal with, or it explains why people who have bad attitude are so destructive. And it's if you ever needed to explain to the rest of the business why not allowing your team to be overrun with troublemakers is worth doing from a business perspective. And the other book is also not particularly positive. But again, it goes into quite a bit of detail of how to manage difficult people in a way that's not confrontational, and it takes the drama out of the dynamics of situations at work without taking up too much of your own energy and time.
They look really interesting. I'll definitely give them a go.
Yeah.
Thanks for sharing your leaving gifts with us, Dan.
Those are mine. But yeah, the Peopleware one by DeMarco and Lister is definitely a lot more positive and more about building up a positive culture, whereas the other two are more about fighting fires.
Brilliant. Thanks once again for that talk, Rob.